Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar, LGBTQ+ Inclusion at Work. My name is Elizabeth White and I'm the Team Lead Learning and Development here at the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be hosting and helping to moderate today's webinar. I would like to start by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We would like to take a brief moment to thank our academic team and our 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent Project. Harnessing Talent Alliance for Recruiting and Retaining Canadians with Disabilities and Mental Health Challenges is a 3-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC, as well as memberships to WWI. We thank our advisory committee and, of course, our speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're just taking a brief moment here and waiting for everyone to join us today, I'll just go through a couple of housekeeping points before we get into our topic today. Hopefully at this point you are able to hear me and see the presentation slide on the screen through your computer speaker and monitor, or if you have called in today, that would be through the conference line that you've chosen. And again, hopefully at minimum you're hearing the presentation thus far. If you are having any technical difficulties or have any questions or comments or need any help of any sort throughout today's webinar, please note in your GoToWebinar tool kind of menu bar that should be on your screen, the questions box is where your communication portal with us holds. So you can use that for anything that you need, as mentioned, technical comments, questions, anything. In particular, I'll draw your attention to that questions bar for the Q&A session that we'll hold at the end of today's time together. And that's where you can submit your questions. You certainly don't need to wait until the very end. Any question that comes to mind at any time, please pass it through to us and we'll be sure to collect it for the Q&A period at the end. I'll also direct to the handout section where there is an FAQ for WWI and does have some tips on technical things and also just some administrative pieces as well. Following the webinar, in case some of those questions are already percolating to your mind, just to confirm, this webinar will be recorded. If we do run out of time today and we don't get quite to all of the questions, we'll be sure to distribute any outstanding answers after. And speaking of post communications, there will be post communications for this webinar that includes the recording as well as the presentation materials. So that will be provided to you, as well as it's always uploaded to our website and eCampus if you're looking for those materials and recordings later as well. Just a quick note to our members. For our organizational member, ARPA Australia, a reminder that you will receive a free certificate of attendance, just ensuring that that record ID field is in your profile so that process is smooth for you, as well as our individual WWI members. A quick note to you that you will also receive a free certificate of attendance as well. Moving into today's topic and webinar and speaker, thank you for going through those housekeepings with me. Today, we are very excited to have Dr. Luke Fletcher with us today. Luke is an associate professor in human resource management at the University of Bath in England. His research is primarily at the intersection of applied psychology and strategic human resources management and includes topics such as employee engagement, meaningful work, and authenticity at work. His latest research interests focus on diversity and inclusion in the workplace, particularly focusing on LGBTQ+ people at work. So thank you so much for joining us today, Luke, and I'm very happily moving it to you for the rest of the presentation today.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth, and it's a pleasure to be here today. And it's great to be doing kind of online webinars. I think with the pandemic, it's really allowed much more scope to kind of be doing these kind of things. So I appreciate the time and the effort that you're taking today, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you about LGBTQ+ inclusion at work. So just to kind of introduce a bit about me, so I joined University of Bath School of Management in the second lockdown in the UK in December 2020. So it's been a bit of a kind of interesting ride, let's say, as I was now been over a year and doing more in-person teaching and so on now, which has been quite nice. I previously was a senior lecturer at Aston Business School, which is in Birmingham. I live still most of the time in Birmingham, which is in the kind of middle of the country. And before that, I was a lecturer at Brighton on the south coast, and previously worked for kind of an applied research institute, a bit like the Work Wellbeing Institute. I'm a psychologist by background. As Elizabeth said, I'm kind of at the intersection between strategic HR and applied psychology. So I kind of look at people's experiences of work, motivation at work, what really gives them a sense of meaning and purpose, and looking at what organizations and HR can do to help facilitate kind of positive well-being and positive experiences at work. So I'm particularly looking at LGBT inclusion at the moment, and that's why I'm giving this talk today. So in terms of the agenda for today, I'll just kind of talk a little bit first about differentiating different terminologies around equality, diversity, inclusion. Quite often you'll probably hear lots of different kind of acronyms around ED&I. So it's often referred to as either D&I, ED&I, and some are now saying IND, as in inclusion first, rather than diversity. So I'll talk a bit quickly about kind of the conceptual differences between those and what that really means. Then we'll go into focusing much more on LGBT plus inclusion, focusing on introducing some terminologies and why it's particularly important to look at LGBT in the workplace. Then going into some of the elements around HR supportive practices and organizational practices around LGBT inclusion. Then getting more specific around the kind of lived experience of LGBT people at work around disclosure, authenticity, and allyship. And then I'll give some examples using some research that I've been doing around those areas as well. So to kick things off then, in terms of differentiating the terminology here around equality, diversity, inclusion, the first thing to note is that although everybody kind of refers to ED&I or collectively, they kind of slightly mean different things. So the kind of focus is slightly different. So I'm particularly interested in inclusion rather than equality and diversity, and I'll come on to more around that later on in the presentation. But equality is much more around the kind of legal framework around anti-discrimination in a particular country. So the idea here is more about ensuring equality of opportunity across different groups. That's generally a kind of legal, a legal terminology, a legal definition around what does equality of opportunity mean and look like. So it's basically around trying to treat people from different backgrounds in a similar way. So you're trying to almost ignore their differences and trying to kind of downplay those differences by trying to treat people with the same kind of respect and in a similar manner across different social groups. So that's kind of generally what's called kind of more blind kind of policies, where it's more around trying to put in place policies and practices that try to equal the playing field, if you like. Diversity is much more around the kind of quantitative representation of different groups across your workforce. So it's much more around trying to look at the wider population. It might be looking at your customer and client groups and thinking about trying to get representation in the workforce that reflects your wider market base or customer base. But it also might represent kind of the wider regional or even global, if you're more in an international context, the wider population in a country or in a region or in a broader international context. And it's about recognizing that different groups will give different attributes and experiences to the table, and recognizing that having representation from different groups in a kind of quantitative way in terms of recruitment and so on gives you those different kind of perspectives that allow you to broaden your customer base, potentially have more innovative ideas and so on. But obviously there's some downsides to diversity in terms of conflict between different groups and so on, which is why inclusion is becoming particularly important, because diversity doesn't really deal with the kind of sense of belonging that people have. So inclusion is moving the discussion forward, and the practices around inclusion look slightly different. And that's about trying to encourage underrepresented groups to have a direct voice and participate more directly and in a more empowered way within the organization. And it's about kind of saying that every person will have a particular set of identities and belong to different groups that allow them to have unique set of skills and knowledge that can really enhance something about their work or what they contribute to the organization. So the difference fundamentally between equality and inclusion is that equality is more about trying to downplay the differences and say that generally people aren't that different and we need to kind of treat people just with respect. And inclusion's kind of turning it the other way and saying, actually, we value everybody's unique contribution because of their backgrounds and the different groups they belong to. So that's fundamentally the kind of the difference there. But collectively, they all kind of come together and are generally quite good to work in kind of parallel in terms of the contribution that you can have with looking at different policies and practices that connect across the 3 different areas. So equality is much more around the kind of legal aspects around anti-discrimination. Diversity is much more around how do you put in place certain policies to attract a diverse range of talent? How do you recruit them in and retain that diversity of talent? And inclusion is much more around allowing people to have a voice, participate more, and a broader sense of belonging and a sense of kind of that they can be authentically themselves, which is why I'm particularly interested in that aspect. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about LGBT inclusion and talking much more around that idea of sense of belonging, authenticity, feeling really connected with the organisation because they value you and your sense of identity as an LGBT+ person. So just to quickly go through some of the terminology, I'm not going to kind of teach you to suck eggs here because I think most people on the call probably understand some of the terminology, but just in case people aren't aware of everything, I'm just going to go through some basic things here. So LGBT is the main kind of acronym, but Q is often now used as part of that, and you might have seen other elements there around I, which is intersex, or A, which is asexual, but it also covers other non-heterosexual or non-cisgender identities. And I'll come on to a minute about cisgender and what that means. But the L generally stands for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender, Q for queer. But I often just put plus at the end to try and cover and acknowledge that there's a whole range of other identities that don't adhere to the kind of heterosexual or cisgender kind of norms. But the main issues really around kind of having a broad umbrella acronym like LGBT or LGBT+, is that it tends to lump sexual orientation and gender identity together, but the two are quite different. And I'll kind of now explain briefly kind of what that difference really means. So some of you might have come across the gender unicorn before. There's also the genderbread person. So you might have heard different versions of this, but this kind of helps try to break down some of the subtleties and differences between aspects of gender, sex, and sexual orientation. So the first thing to note is that kind of your sexual orientation can be broken down into both elements around physical attraction and emotional attachment. So it can be either one or the other or both. So when we talk about sexual orientation, in a general sense, we're talking about your overall kind of attraction to another person or another gender, and that can be physical and or emotional. When we talk about gender, we're talking about a broader concept than sex. So sex is more around your kind of biological and physical attributes. and characteristics. And we often talk about, within the context of trans and on non-binary people, well, trans specifically, and intersex, we're talking about what sex you were assigned at birth, and whether that is connected to how you think about your gender identity in the broader sense. So gender identity is a broader kind of socially constructed aspect around who you think you are in terms of femininity and masculinity. And you can be very much strongly in the masculine area, for example, or strongly feminine or somewhere in between. But your gender expression is more around the kind of outward expression of that to other people. And that could be congruent or in alignment with that identity, or it could be different from that. So you might be feeling uncomfortable to express the way that you're feeling about yourself or thinking about yourself in terms of your identity. And so you might suppress that and express a different type of gender expression to the one that you feel more comfortable with. For other people, it might be that they are more fluid and they want to express their gender in different ways and in different contexts. So they might present themselves slightly differently at work to what they might present outside of work, for example. So it's quite, it gets quite nuanced and quite tricky to kind of unpick, which is why it's important to kind of think about it a little bit more and kind of look at some of these diagrams and visuals and various different resources that can help try and break this down. And again, there's no kind of right way or wrong way necessarily. There's quite a lot of change and development over time. Gender unicorn has developed over several years, and the language and terminology, particularly around gender identity and different sexualities, is changing quite a lot, and also it's culturally dependent. So in some countries or some cultures, they might have different labels and terminologies and different types of gender expressions, for example, than in others. So it's quite a complicated and multi-layered kind of area. In terms of generally then why we want to explore LGBT plus people at work, is that in a general kind of research focus, there's quite a lot of evidence to say that kind of the invisible stigma around LGBT identity. So you're not always going to be visible to people in terms of, if you think about the expression of your sexuality or the expression of your gender, you know, you can choose to reveal or choose to conceal certain parts of that identity in the workplace. And so there's quite a lot of research around what effects does that have on the individual in terms of their well-being, and that actively trying to conceal or mask identity or fake a kind of heterosexual identity, for example, is quite damaging. But kind of disclosing and being more open about your identity at work is sometimes quite helpful for people. But there's also the dynamics of kind of how do LGBT plus people navigate a culture that's quite heteronormative. So for example, in a call that I had yesterday, it was online and across the world, and the main organizer started talking about introducing himself and his children as part of talking about his wider life to kind of introduce himself. But then that set the tone that everybody then started talking about their kind of marriage situation and their children, and I'm not married and I don't have children, and so it became a little bit kind of uncomfortable in that situation to kind of explain, well, I don't have children, whereas 90% of the people on the call did. So again, you can be navigating a culture where those kind of signs and cues might make people feel a bit uncomfortable in certain situations. And also quite a lot of LGBT people have internalized homophobia or biphobia or transphobia because of the being brought up in kind of heteronormative cultures when they were younger. In terms of the work context, there's a lot of evidence to suggest there's quite a lot of stereotypes, particularly kind of masculine stereotypes around what we think about when we think about managers and leaders, and the kind of lack of role models around gender identity and sexual orientation. There tends to be kind of this kind of role modeling around kind of more masculine types of characteristics around managers and leaders. That's changing, but there's still quite a lot of kind of way to go with that. We also have gendered occupations, where you might find that in certain occupations it's much more open to LGBT people. So a lot of people might then become, for example, hairdressers or air stewards and air stewardesses and so on. But that's not because the occupation is necessarily about being gay or lesbian, but it might be to do with the type of acceptance in those occupations or the opportunities it provides them to express themselves. So there's quite a lot of kind of evidence around why there might be gendered occupations in certain sectors. You've also got things like stereotype threat, that in certain situations, if certain stereotypes are then kind of more salient or apparent, that you might then change your behavior implicitly as a result of those stereotypes. So for example, if you are in maybe a situation where kind of the stereotype is around being camp and silly as a gay person, then you might actually start behaving according to those stereotypes implicitly. There might be variation in history of legal protection. This is very poignant at the moment in the UK because there's been quite a lot of debates around gender identity and conversion therapy, for example. So that can change quite quickly within a country, or it could take a very long time. And we're seeing quite a lot of issues around legal protections in different countries, which still need to be really looked at. And that will have a big impact on how people feel at work. For example, in certain countries, actually, workplaces is where people can feel more comfortable and actually have some protection comparatively to kind of outside in their wider lives and families. You might have quite a lot of tokenism and corporate fads going on, particularly around pride. That seems to be a bit of a kind of pink washing aspect at the moment, where some companies are perhaps doing a lot of social media stuff and paying for floats on pride parades, but actually when you look at what's going on the ground for LGBT employees in that company, they might not be doing as much as what they're saying they're doing in terms of kind of the tokenistic gestures. So that needs looking at as well, that the policies and practices on the ground really need to match up with what they're kind of marketing themselves as externally. And there's generally quite a lot of lack of HR knowledge and skills and policy and practice gaps, particularly around gender identity. Organisations are starting to kind of develop more knowledge around that, and HR professional bodies are starting to kind of look at that more specifically. But there's still quite a lot of movement there that needs to be made around expertise and knowledge within HR. So in terms of understanding LGBT working lives, I was involved in a big survey project in the UK with the HR professional body or people management professional body in the UK, the CIPD, and that's free to download. So that link should give you access to the report, and that's based on a big survey that they did. Well, they do that every year, not on LGBT people, but generally across different occupations and workers in the UK. But we were particularly interested on LGBT working lives. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from that report to help you understand why is it particularly important to look at, and why does HR need to do more about being more inclusive for LGBT people. So this is based on some data from that report on the experiences of conflict at work. So there was a question in the survey that asked whether that person had experienced a range of different workplace conflicts, from kind of relatively minor things around verbal confrontation to kind of escalation of kind of verbal abuse, physical abuse, to kind of sexual assaults and so on. So I've picked out a few examples where there's particularly a impact on the LGBT people. So out of those 11 types of conflicts, in terms of overall, just adding those things together and looking at, the percentage of people that actually experienced some kind of workplace conflict over the last 12 months, around 30% of heterosexual people experienced that. Then it goes up to nearly 40% for sexual minorities. So this at the moment just looks at LGB people, so more on the sexual orientation side, and that goes up slightly further for female sexual minorities. For trans people, we did a separate trans and non-binary survey. It's a smaller number, but we found that the rates of conflict were even higher for trans and non-binary people. So it kind of looks quite damaging in terms of what's happening for people in the workplace. In terms of the main areas where there was a much bigger increase in these conflicts, feeling undermined and humiliated was particularly important, or a particularly important conflict that was experienced. So you can see there that 13% of heterosexuals, 20% of sexual minorities, and 27% of female sexual minorities experienced feeling undermined or humiliated at work over the last 12 months. And I think that goes up even higher for trans and non-binary. And discriminatory behaviour was also one of those that was quite significantly higher across all of the LGBT plus groups. What was particularly significant, but in a kind of a difficult conflict to look at, was sexual assault and unwanted sexual attention. And you can see on the sexual assault, although that's very small, you don't really want anybody to really experience sexual assault at work. So to see kind of 0.2% heterosexuals, but that rising to kind of nearly 2% for female sexual minorities. And that was, when we compared it to female heterosexuals, that was still quite a lot higher. So that's kind of worrying that there's that kind of quite a big step increase in sexual assault there. And unwanted sexual attention, you can see that's quite a big increase as well for female sexual minorities. And that was also higher than for female heterosexuals. So generally speaking, it's quite a worrying kind of set of results really, and which is why we wanted to kind of explore why it's important to look at inclusion for LGBT plus people. One of the ways that we can kind of help reduce conflicts and try and make it a safer environment for LGBT people is by putting in place very specific, or a specific set of HR supported practices. Now, a lot of organisations will have a general strategy and framework around diversity and inclusion, and they might have particular statements and kind of pillars that are represented under that framework. But it's also important to have a specific set of policies and practices that address particular groups, because stigmatized social groups will attend to those cues, and that will signal to whether it's safe for them to express themselves in the workplace. For LGBT people, it's knowing that there's a specific set of policies and practices that meet their needs and address certain concerns they have about their own identity in the workplace. So it's important that, yes, you might have a really good diversity inclusion strategy and a general set of principles and policies like anti-discrimination policy, but it's really important to also kind of underpin that with very specific kind of sub-policies and practices that connect with those specific groups. So in terms of what this might look like for LGBT-friendly practices, I've done some work kind of trying to consolidate this into kind of a perceptual measure. So asking LGBT people about their perceptions of different policies and practices within their own organisations. And some of that can be considered to be under certain aspects around anti-discrimination practices that focus much more on anti-discrimination for LGBT plus people, specific diversity training around LGBT identities, and helping people understand things like terminology and the challenges that LGBT people might be facing. The consideration of intersectionality, so that actually some of the challenges might be compounded, and disadvantage might be compounded by, say, your ethnicity and your social class, for example. Having particular avenues and mechanisms that provide voice and participation. So, for example, having an LGBT staff network, or having staff representative groups where you invite LGBT people who are willing to participate in those kind of activities. Having training and support to managers so they can act more inclusively and enforcing that across the workforce. And perhaps doing some CSR type activities and your marketing communication and generally your branding and things about recruitment and so on that kind of facilitate LGBT inclusive language and kind of activities. So in that CIPD report I mentioned earlier, we looked particularly at perceptions of trans and non-binary people and what they thought was in place and their perception of those policies within their own organisation. And why I mention it is because you might have these things in place, you might put these policies together, but you really need to ask your LGBT employees and also other minority groups about how they're feeling about those policies and practices. Are they thinking that they're adequate enough? Are they satisfied that they're actually being enforced and so on? And this survey demonstrated why that's particularly important, because only, out of all of the particular policies in place, overall only 31% actually agreed that they were kind of being impactful and actually making a difference. And if you look at the specific elements here, only 50% of those agreed that there was adequate anti-discrimination policies that protected trans and non-binary people, to the worst elements around support and guidance to managers to help support trans workers. One of the biggest kind of issues, if you like, around trans and non-binary inclusion is around their first port of call if they want to formally acknowledge that they want to go through a transitionary journey or want to get support from the organisation around their trans and non-binary identity and how they might manage that in the workplace. They often go to their line manager, and the line manager is often the person that is the worst equipped, or the kind of the one that doesn't have enough knowledge around that and the skill set to handle that. So just having some kind of support framework in place and guidance and training to managers so that they can feel more comfortable about how to deal with those situations. So that's kind of talking a bit more about policies. Now we'll kind of talk about kind of moving on now to talk more about the lived experience of LGBT people in the workplace. So quite often they're seen as being invisible. So I mentioned that early on, and they're trying to manage the extent to which they might be open about their identity in everyday interactions at work. So they might be kind of choosing to reveal more information to kind of close colleagues, for example, and they might kind of step back and withdraw some of that information. And they might, for example, not talk about their outside lives or what they did at the weekend to people that they might not know that well, or to more senior people or their clients. And so that kind of active concealment or faking, some might even fake their identity and actually fake that they've got kind of an opposite sex partner, for example. And that can be quite detrimental to their well-being. And quite a lot of research suggests that the more someone is more open in disclosing their identity at work, the more it promotes positive attitudes and well-being. But that's not always the case, which is why I'm looking at authenticity, that not everybody wants to disclose everything about themselves all the time at work, and that can be quite draining in itself. But the research suggests that the most important factors are those kind of formal protections and policies, like I said earlier. It kind of sets the baseline and a kind of safety net. And that also helps then create the foundations to build a psychologically safe and supportive climate. So having kind of more vocal support from managers and from senior leaders about that, and having co-workers that really support LGBT inclusion, and having supportive relationships and friendships with people in the organisation, and perceiving that their reaction to you disclosing is kind of positive. But why I'm particularly interested in going beyond disclosure is that I don't think disclosure is kind of all the kind of means to an end. It's some people don't want to be always disclosing their identity at work. And I think for me, it's more about understanding authenticity, about really feeling that you can be authentically yourself without having always to disclose everything about yourself in an interaction or at work in general. And we can see this as connecting with three elements here. The idea of authentic living. So how are you behaving in ways that are kind of aligned to your values and your beliefs and your kind of identity? And then the lack of the other two, so a lack of self-alienation. So when you're at work, you're not kind of feeling estranged and disconnecting from yourself, that you feel that when you're at work, you're really connecting with yourself in a way that's positive and reinforcing your identity and expressing yourself into your work role, so you're being able to be more creative and perform better. And then the other thing is to not get too pressured by external influence around you. Obviously, when we go to work, we're performing a work role, we're performing a certain role in the organization. So we are having to adapt how we behave towards the organization, but it's not being too pressured by that, that you're kind of still allowing yourself to adapt and find ways to express yourself without feeling that added pressure. So linking this all together then, I've done some work with a colleague of mine, Ben Everly, looking at, we did a survey, a kind of survey design looking at LGBT employees and what their perceptions was on various supportive practices, like I explained earlier. So we measured about 8 or 9 different practices, and we kind of collectively scored that and looked at the stronger, more positive perception of those practices seem to link positively linked to their extent of disclosure. So they're more open about their LGBT identity at work. They were more open about it to different people at work, and they felt more authentically themselves at work, so that they had that higher sense of felt authenticity. But it was particularly that experience of authenticity that linked to their general sense of life satisfaction. So their overall sense of well-being and feeling generally content with their life in that moment and in time. So we kind of tentatively think that authenticity is potentially more powerful in terms of that psychological process than just simply being out of the closet and being open at work. So it's really developing the idea that we need to go beyond the idea of just being out at work and thinking about it in terms of that experience of authenticity. But the other area to consider that we haven't really looked at yet, which is line managers and senior leaders. So line managers are really often the first port of call for handling conflict, for example, and in being the first point of call where LGBT people might come to kind of try to gain support within the wider infrastructure of the organization. So it's really important that line managers are able to be respectful and supportive and understand some of the complexity around LGBT identities. The other thing that's really important is senior leaders who are visible and acting as role models within the organization. And because primarily it's their attitude towards inclusion, and whether they support it or not and actually disregard some of the initiatives going on in the organization, that's going to have quite a big impact. And there was a story, I think last year during the pandemic, where the UK chairman of KPMG resigned because they kind of were talking about people in a really negative way, about stop moaning about kind of being victims, for example, and kind of saying that some of the diversity training that was going on in the organization was not very good and was useless. So if they're saying all that kind of stuff and they're not being actively supporting, actually disregarding what's happening in the organization, it can have quite a big impact on how people are feeling and whether they're really embracing the inclusion efforts within the organization. The other thing to think about is also staff networks and or employee resource groups. I know in North America, quite a lot of companies talk about ERGs now, employee resource groups. And these kind of started to emerge from kind of the 1960s and affinity groups, particularly around race. But they've really kind of taken off in the early 2000s onwards. And I'm sure a lot of your organizations will be doing ERGs or staff networks. And there's kind of a whole wide range of them. And there's quite a lot of research evidence suggests that they're not always that impactful and not always that inclusive, but they can be with the right the right thinking, the right strategies, given enough budget and resources, and giving them decision-making power within the organizations, not just kind of leaving them to it, because often if they don't have any budget, they don't have any power, they don't have any voice, they just get together and just do socials, for example, which isn't always as effective for kind of creating positive change within the organization. So it's also important to kind of consider how you're utilizing ERGs and also how you're utilizing them together. So quite often some ERGs become quite siloized. So you might have a very specific one on kind of female empowerment, you might have one on race and ethnicity, you might have another one on LGBT, and they're all doing different things at different times, and there's not that kind of cohesion. So it's important to kind of try to look at the broader strategy around them and bring them together. Which brings me on to the kind of next element, which is on allies and allyship programs, which has kind of been a kind of offshoot from the ERGs, really, about that in terms of helping employee resource groups really gain traction and have impact. Quite often, if they're just siloized to employees that are from those identity groups, then they might not have the kind of impact and wider kind of influence within the organization. So allies have become kind of a way that kind of people that are in the kind of more majority groups within the organization that have perhaps more power and influence are able to help the inclusion efforts going on in the organization by learning more about being an ally to different groups and developing their skill set in terms of allyship.
So just looking at about 5 minutes until potentially
Okay.
Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. So this brings me on to the kind of latest research that I've done on looking at transgender inclusion and around allyship. So I'm just going to talk you quite quickly through this, but I'm very happy to kind of send you more details on this. And there's also some other recordings going into more detail on this piece of research. So in terms of what is allyship, it's important to kind of think about what the concept means. And there's two kind of elements here that might be somewhat in conflict. So in one sense, there's you as a kind of majority or dominant group member who wants to work to end oppression of other people around other people's oppression. But it's very much linked to your idea of that you are an ally and your identity as an ally and your motives and values. On the other hand, there's what is practicing allyship. So the kind of what are you doing on the ground? What are the kind of behaviors that you're demonstrating? What are the skill sets that you're developing and knowledge that you're developing as a result? So it's more about the kind of the practice of allyship rather than the kind of identity of being an ally. And what's particularly important that we need to kind of focus more on the idea of practicing allyship rather than just kind of patting ourselves on the back and saying, yeah, I'm a good ally. Which is why we wanted to kind of look at this in more detail. So we wanted to kind of think about how allyship could be applied to trans workers. And we looked particularly at the everyday kind of interpersonal dimension of allyship, because there's other elements of allyship around kind of activism and connecting with kind of activist groups and so on. But we wanted to focus more on the workplace and what kind of people on the ground in organizations could be doing, like co-workers. So we looked at it in terms of providing active support, being willing to stand up for and being identified as an ally to trans workers. And we looked at first on what the intentions of heterosexual cisgender workers were when they were presented with a hypothetical but realistic workplace scenario around a trans person wanting to formally let people know in their organization about their intention to transition in the workplace and what that might mean. And after that scenario, they were then asked to rate various things, and part of that was rating the extent to which they would show allyship behaviors to that trans worker. So would they stand up for them? Would they give their full support to them? Or would they be a visible ally to them? And this is the scenario. I'm not going to go, the slides will be sent out to you. So I'm going to quickly kind of move on from this, but this just gives you the context of the scenario that was given to the participants. The first thing that we were interested in is that there's some people that might be quite reluctant to show support for trans people and might be generally reluctant to kind of buy into the idea of inclusion. And this goes back to kind of what's called social dominance orientation in social psychology. So this is where people have an attitude where they support, they generally think that some groups should be on the top and others at the bottom in society, that some groups of people are just simply inferior to other groups, that actually it's quite unjust to make groups equal, and that actually there's other things to worry about than just to kind of create to make groups equal. So they much more favor a structured, rigid hierarchy in society, and they support policies that maintain that hierarchy. On the other side, we wanted to look at what the organization was doing in terms of creating a diverse and inclusive climate. So we asked those participants to reflect on their organization and their climate within the organization. And we were asking them to rate different aspects around that. So for example, whether they thought their organization made it easy for people from diverse backgrounds to fit in and be accepted, whether they felt employees were valued for the differences they brought because of their backgrounds and so on. And what we were interested in looking at is whether that climate could actually buffer or negate the negative impact that having that kind of quite rigid social dominance attitude would have. So if the climate was quite strong, then we expected that actually people that were quite high in that social dominance orientation would be less likely to kind of be reluctant. So they would be more willing to actually show trans allyship intentions. So we did find that. So if you look on where the circle bit is, so that just shows you that for those, the kind of broken arrow, the broken line shows those for the high perceived diversity inclusion climate, there was less of a difference. So the slope was less severe, which shows you that those in high social dominance orientation actually were more likely to show trans allyship intentions when they were in that strong, diverse and inclusive climate in their organization. When they were in a low, when they thought there was kind of less of that diversity inclusion climate, that actually reduced their intention to show allyship. So that's why we wanted to kind of show that climate was particularly important in an organization. And we also wanted to look on the other side of the coin on psychological effects of trans allyship. Now I'm going to quickly move forward with this because of time, but we surveyed a number of trans workers in the UK and looked at their perceptions of allyship within their own organisation, that they felt they had allies and people were standing up for them in the organisation. And we wanted to see whether that would actually connect with their sense of engagement at work, that they felt kind of enthusiastic, energized and attentive towards their work, because feeling that they had some allyship in the organization would make them feel psychologically safe, which then would help them kind of engage with their work and feel less kind of worried about what's going on in the organization. And the other side, we wanted to look at their kind of general well-being. So whether they felt actually that feeling that sense of allyship would help them feel more authentic at work, and then feel that they were more satisfied with their life in general and feel that greater sense of well-being. So we generally found that to be the case, that allyship promotes psychological safety, promotes authenticity, and they kind of then translate into kind of feeling more engaged at work, which helps with kind of things like performance, and then their general sense of well-being in a broader kind of life satisfaction aspect. So summing up then, LGBT people face many inequalities, and their experiences have generally been under-researched, particularly in the kind of management and HR field. That ED&I policies and practices can be really helpful because they create the kind of norms and climate that help undermine those kind of inclinations to act according to kind of more exclusive anti-egalitarianism kind of attitudes. But being more specific around your policies and putting together more specific LGBT practices would help kind of consolidate that general ED&I framework. And that allyship is particularly important as well to help create that kind of environment that's supportive and conducive for that general sense of well-being for LGBT workers. So that kind of brings me up to it. I know I kind of rushed through the last 5 minutes, but by all means, contact me afterwards if you want more information or want to ask any more questions. But I now open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation and all of that wonderful information. I'll just remind our audience that the questions box is where you can communicate with us with all of your questions during this time. And I'll kick things off with our first question here. Just a quick one around resources. Training is something that you mentioned quite a bit through the presentation, and so the question is around looking for resources to help educate those members of the organizations that might not have a strong understanding of LGBTQ+ issues.
Yeah, so I think in terms of wider resources and so on, I think I know more about the UK context. So, but I think what's important is to reach out to LGBT specific organisations that offer training and support and resources within Canada. I know that in the UK we have kind of Stonewall, we have LGBT Foundation, we have a few others. So it's worth kind of thinking about just doing a Google search and seeing what LGBT specific organizations are out there and approach them for some guidance or some advice, or if you've got budget to kind of pay for people to come in to kind of do a consultation with you. In terms of kind of more informal resources, a lot of organizations will put kind of lists of kind of things like terminology up, podcasts and documentaries and videos and so on that you can look at. So it's always worth kind of trawling through kind of resource web pages and so on for things like terminologies and things like that as well.
Yeah, that's a great thing to think about, both formal and informal. What can we kind of touch base really quickly and then more that formal road. The next question we have here, thinking about kind of the climate and the different kind of metrics you were discussing, is there any kind of diversity metric, so to speak, that employers could track or be any advice around measuring that DEI, climate, or all those things you talked about in the workplace?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's quite a lot of consultancies that would be doing D&I kind of surveys, if you like, and audits. So I'll just be careful about kind of just understanding what you particularly want to look for, and those kind of consultancies, try and ask them questions about how they've validated those measures, what measures have they, what steps have they put in place to kind of make sure that they're robust and actually measuring what they're claiming to measure. In terms of academia, I can point you to various other things. Academics have been publishing lots of different measures around diversity and inclusion for years. Some of them are unfortunately behind kind of paywalls that only if you've got university kind of institutional access you can access. But I'm very happy to kind of provide some papers and resources in that sense as well if you email me. But the problem with academic ones that they're not necessarily able to be benchmarked. So they're often kind of designed around specific studies, research studies, and they're not necessarily looking at wider benchmarking of industries and so on. But consultancies will offer those kind of products, but just be mindful, some of them are better than others in that space.
Is there anything that you would say more generally, maybe informally, that just as potentially a leader or just even an employee, sitting in the workplace, that can kind of give some indicators of whether there is an inclusive environment or whether there is not, just kind of more from an informal taking stock, looking around kind of a lens?
Yeah, I think in terms of subtle cues you can kind of pick up on is if you kind of get a sense that people are not that open about their wider outside lives. I mean, some people are private anyway, but in terms of, are you just noticing a pattern there that, you know, people are just not really that open, or kind of shying away from talking about things, or, you know, you're noticing some people are withdrawing from conversations or from social activities. I mean, that goes to a broader well-being aspect as well, I suppose. I think also kind of asking the question, maybe doing some focus groups or team meetings where you just say, well, you know, we want to talk about, you know, how people are feeling in terms of, you know, their ability to share knowledge with each other, their ability to kind of be open with each other. You can do that kind of one-to-one, or through kind of like a anonymous survey, for example, to get some feedback. So it's more about understanding kind of, do people feel psychologically safe? I think that's an important aspect, and whether they feel kind of comfortable when they come to work, you know, in their own skin and what they're contributing.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that. Looking at the kind of policy side that we talked about today as well. So someone's included, I'd like to include members of my organization who are members of the LGBTQ plus community in the development of the EDI policies. How can I best make it comfortable for them to get involved, or even kind of increase their level of engagement and involvement without making it feel required to disclose, or perhaps go into areas that they might not feel comfortable?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's an important kind of aspect around the allyship angle, which is about not placing too much emotional burden on minority groups. So, for example, you know, if there's only one openly trans person in the organization, you know, you don't go immediately to them and say, I want you to design, you know, a new gender identity policy because you've gone through it in our organization. So I think it's just about perhaps going, if you've got an LGBT staff network or a trade union, for example, that you're quite close to, then perhaps reaching out to those kind of formal mechanisms of voice and participation might be useful, because at least you're channeling that energy through a kind of formal mechanism. Informally, you know, you could do a kind of more broader email out to people and just say you're maybe doing a kind of a general consultation, and you're welcoming some views on certain things. And I think just allowing them to kind of place the boundaries of what they're willing to contribute, but be clear what kinds of thing you want them to contribute to. Because I think if they don't really know what the purpose is or what the focus is, or why you might want to be doing certain things, then they might kind of go, oh, well, I don't really know, you know, or they might shy away from it. So yeah, just be clear of the purpose and intent and the kind of general aspects that you want them to contribute to, but allow them to kind of to say, okay, that I can contribute to, that I can't, or you know, I'm not sure about that. I can only speak about from my own personal perspective, for example.
Right. That actually leads a little into a follow-up question, and perhaps what you've just shared does help to negate this, is just that idea of ensuring that those underrepresented voices are there but are not feeling tokenized at the same time. And is that what you've kind of just described? Would you say, is that how you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no kind of right way or wrong way necessarily.
Right.
I think it's just trying to be sensitive, and try and approach it, try and think about it from their point of view. So try and take their perspective and think about it from their point of view, and just maybe be yeah, just try and develop an open communication that isn't kind of directive. So quite often in organizations, you get kind of asked to be doing certain tasks and contribute in specific ways, but that can be very task orientated, whereas this is a little bit more like, we want your ideas to shape things. I think the main thing really is to show how you're going to implement those ideas into practice, because what I think annoys people, particularly people from minority groups, is that you want stuff from them, but then you do your own, you don't actually include any of that in the actual final policy or document or strategy. So yeah, just kind of be clear with them what you can and what you can't implement or act upon or take on board, so then they know that what their contribution is, and why there might be bounds to that contribution, for example.
No, that's wonderful to think about, and also, as you mentioned, kind of something perhaps that can be gone beyond the LGBTQ plus group that we've talked about today, but even the other types of minorities or voices that need to be at the table, perhaps disabilities, other groups like that, to all kind of come to that table in the ways that you've suggested today. Yeah, I'm just looking. We've actually gotten right to the top of the hour already, which is that it's been a wonderful time together with all of this wonderful information and great discussion at the end. So I'll just take the last minute to close and also remind, as Luke has said already, if there are any outstanding questions or looking for further resources, we're happy to connect and continue to facilitate that conversation. I will also point you to the handouts bar within your GoToWebinar menu, as Luke has very wonderfully added a handout there as well that has some resources, as well as just the FAQ for WWI that deals with some technical and administrative FAQs as well. So just to close out today, a quick reminder, this was recorded. You will receive emails post this event that has all of the presentation materials, the recording, as well as links to the website as well, where it will be hosted there and on our eCampus. For certificates of attendance, our organizational and WWI members, you will receive that automatically through the processes. And if certificates are of interest to you, please email membershipservices@workwellnessinstitute.org to find out more about our certificate program, as well as our membership program, and perhaps join us in membership today. Immediately following the webinar session, you will be directed to an evaluation survey, and we very much appreciate you taking that moment of your time, as we do use this valuable feedback for future topic areas and to continue our programming and ensuring its relevancy and timeliness to our audience. All of our webinars are created for public access and supported by memberships and funding sponsors. And I'll just point to our next webinar is on May 11th on office spatial design, but please be sure to check out our Learn and Connect section of our website to stay up to date on all of our educational and webinar programming. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today and taken time out of your day to spend with us on such an important topic. We look forward to seeing you again. And thank you to you, Luke, as well, for offering your time and expertise and discussions today. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. And it's great to be kind of doing some more outreach work than just writing papers and sitting in my office. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. I'll now be closing the webinar.